Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Joshua Moehling at Dakota County Library, Burnhaven. Minnesota's own Joshua Moehling is a unique voice and rising star in the crowded mystery and thriller landscape. He introduced fans to Deputy Sheriff Ben Packard in the seemingly idyllic town of Sandy Lake in 2023. Notes the Associated Press, Moehling's debut, And There He Kept Her, plays out something like on TV, resembling Yellowstone in its small town setting and larger-than-life drama, set against captivatingly detailed scenery. It's a great opportunity to get into a new detective series at the ground level. Many readers did exactly that, And There He Kept Her and Packard's sophomore outing, Where the Dead Sleep in 2024, were contenders for the Lambda Literary Award for Best LGBTQ Mystery. Moehling's latest thriller, A Long Time Gone, hinges around the haunting disappearance of Packard's own brother, a cold case that cracks wide open after decades of questions and speculation. First Clue Reviews raves, "The third in the series is far and away the best." It's amazing how Moehling keeps all these narrative balls in the air, but even more amazing is how they eventually come together.
Hi, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday night and to hear an author ramble on. So I have just one question before we get started. Have people read the third book? A few hands, a few. Okay, I thought I would just start and talk a little bit about how I came to write these books, and then maybe a little bit about each one, and then we'll take your questions and we'll just kind of let that direct the conversation. How about that? Okay, I'm living my dream right now. I can't believe that these books have done so well, so fast. I wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid. I didn't want to be a musician or a sports star. I wanted to be a writer, which is, I think, a weird thing for little kids to want to be. But I was a super bookish kid. I did not like going outside. I just wanted to go to the library and get books and read books and go back to the library and get more books. And when my dad or my parents told me to go outside and play, it meant take my book in the backyard and read it in the backyard. I didn't want anything to do with a ball. I didn't want to throw a ball or catch a ball or chase a ball. I was like having none of that. I just wanted to read books. And my mom was in the Army, and so we ended up moving like every 3 or 4 years. But everywhere we went, whatever base we were stationed on, there was always a library, and that was always the first thing that we sought out, or at least I sought out whenever we got to our new station. I was an English major in college. I graduated from the University of South Dakota, and with no job and no prospects, and came to Minnesota, and I had a friend who lived here who's like, "Yeah, you can live with me while you figure out what you're going to do." So that's how I ended up in Minneapolis. And then I was doing kind of temp jobs and graphic design work, and then I ended up going to Mankato State University, and I got accepted into the MFA program at Mankato. And it was a 3-year program, and I was teaching and taking out a whole bunch of student loans and spending them at the bar. And I got to kind of like the halfway point of that program, and I was like, it just wasn't for me. I wasn't getting out of it what I wanted, and I don't think I knew what I wanted. It was a great program, and I made a lot of great friends, and I had a really good time, but it was costing a lot of money, and I didn't feel like I was getting any closer to writing a novel or kind of achieving that dream that I had of being a writer. So I dropped out, and I came back to the cities and worked for a long time. I started to get a master's degree in scientific and technical communication at the U of M to be a tech writer. And then I got a job as a tech writer and at Guidant at the time. And then I was like, well, what do I need the degree if I have the job? Because it was also costing me more money to take out these student loans. And so that pretty much ended my post-secondary education. And so I started my career in the medical device industry. And I think this is, between leaving Mankato and when I got serious about trying to write something was maybe like 10 years. I think I was, I was young and I was going out and I was having fun and I was getting in trouble, and sitting at home and writing wasn't really the priority at that point. But I always had this thought in the back of my head. I was like, you always wanted to be a writer. You always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be Stephen King when I grew up. I read my very first Stephen King book when I was 11 years old, which is probably too young to read a Stephen King book. It was Cujo, and I don't know, there was some stuff in that book that went right over my head. But yeah, I was like, come on, you've always had this dream of being a writer. Are you going to do this or not? Because if you want to be a writer, you've got to write something. And it had been like 10 years since I quit grad school, and I didn't have anything to show for it. And I was absolutely intimidated and kind of terrified at the idea of writing a novel. It just seemed like an impossible task to me. Like, I thought I was going to write a novel like I was going to climb Mount Everest, and I thought I needed all this specialized training and gear to write a novel. But then I don't know, I had an idea for a book, and I was like, well, I don't know if this is a novel idea, but I'm just going to write this story that I have an idea for. And that first book was about a boy who's spending the summer with his dad on a farm in South Dakota, and his dad is a beekeeper, and there's a Bigfoot that lives in the water tower, and the old woman on the farm next door is a witch. And I was like, okay, so then I just started writing a story. And my dad is a beekeeper, and when we were kids, we would always, when he put us to bed, we'd always ask him for a Bigfoot story. So this kind of combined like a lot of things that I knew from my childhood. We lived for a while on this poor farm in Iowa that, where the kind of indigent people in the county lived in the 30s and 40s. And when we lived there, it was just a big old rambling empty house. And my dad kept his bees on the land. And there was an old water tower in this really tiny town, and he would tell us Bigfoot stories, and he would tell us that the Bigfoot lived in the water tower, and would come down at night looking for little boys who weren't asleep yet. And I just got us all wound up. I don't know what he was thinking, getting my brother and I so wound up right before bed, but we absolutely loved it. And so this first book I started writing kind of combined all these elements, and along the way, I figured out it's not like climbing a mountain. It is like climbing a mountain, but just like climbing a mountain, you just do it kind of one step at a time. And writing a book, you just sit down every day, or as often as you can, and you just write a few more words, and you write a few more words, and you write a few more words, and the pages start to stack up. And pretty soon, you've got 100 pages, and then you have 200 pages. And then I took a class at the Loft. It was called Working on Your Novel with Mary Gardner, and she read these first few pages, or the first 100 pages of this book I wrote, and Mary's thing was she hated technology. She was about 70 years old when I took the class, and she was about this tall, And she had no use for computers or cell phones or email. And she wrote every student a letter on her typewriter after she read your manuscript with her notes about what she read. And I always remember that, getting that letter back from her, and the first line of the letter said, "My God, you can write." And that was just like, oh. And I don't know what it was. It was about Mary, or that was just what I needed to hear from somebody I respected and wanted to hear from it at the right time. And that book was terrible. It was really, really bad. But she saw something in the writing, and I kept after it, and I finished writing that book. And I think I sent it to a few agents, and of course nobody was interested in it because it was a really, really bad book. But what writing that book taught me was that I could write a book. And it taught me that it's not an impossible task to write a book. And so I put that aside, and I started writing another book. And I took the class at the Loft again with Mary, and just kind of kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And 5 years later, I had a second novel. And that book was set in this small town of Sandy Lake that I invented. And there was a writer who I kind of modeled on Stephen King, who lives in a small town in Maine. And I thought, well, okay, we have a writer who lives in a small town in Minnesota. And then he has a private plane, and he's going south for the winter, and the plane crashes. And then everybody's wondering, did he finish the last novel he was working on, which was the last in the series that everybody's been reading for 30 years. And he's got a handyman with a traumatic brain injury who works for him. And at one point in that book, the handyman, after he gets interviewed by the sheriff's deputy, he's telling his best friend about it. And they have this conversation, and the best friend says, "Do you think that cop is gay?" And the handyman's like, "What?" And then they just kind of go back and forth about whether like the local cop is gay or not, and make some crude jokes at his expense. And then the story carried on from there. And I wrote that book, and I sent it to a bunch of agents, and maybe like 40 or 50, and half a dozen of them came back and said they wanted to read the whole entire book. And then all half a dozen of them came back and said, it doesn't work. And I was like, okay. And I'd spent like a long time on this book. It was probably another 5 years, like writing this book. And I was so sick of it. I didn't know how to fix it. They're great at telling you what doesn't work. They're not so great at telling you how to make it work. You've got to figure that part out. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to keep going, because now I've got 2 books under my belt, and I know I can keep doing this, and I'm trying to figure out what am I going to write about next. And I like this small town, this Sandy Lake town that I kind of came up with in north central Minnesota. And I just was kind of thinking, well, what about that gay cop? Where did he come from? And there was no reason for that guy to be gay in that other book. He didn't even have a name in that book. He just was a really, really insignificant secondary character who was a butt of a joke, and then that was it. And it's just kind of, I marvel at why I made that decision when I made it, and how that decision changed my life, really. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to write, what would it be like to be a gay cop in a small rural town? It's probably very conservative. What brought him there? What's his life like? What's his work life like? I'm going to try to answer all those questions. And so I wrote the book, and there he kept her. And it took me a few years again, and I went back to one of those 6 agents who read the last book. She said, this book doesn't work, but I want to see what you write next. And so I wrote And There He Kept Her, and it was probably 3 years, maybe 4 years later, and I just went right straight back to her inbox. And I said, Barbara, you said you want to see what I wrote next. Here it is. And she took about 6 months to read it and get back to me, and then she's like, I love it. I'm going to be your agent. So I thought that was the hard part. I thought getting the agent was the hard part. I had no idea what was to come. Because once you get an agent, then your agent's job is to sell the book. And I thought, okay, here's the book. The agent loves it. We're done. But what happened was she took the book. We spent probably 6 months working on the book together, the two of us. And then she sent it to her #1 top editor at the biggest publisher in the world. And this guy called me and we talked for about an hour, and he told me how much he loved the book, and then he told me everything that was wrong with the book. And I said, okay, I can fix all of that. And so I spent about 3 months rewriting the book to his notes, and then waited. Then you wait for like 2 or 3 months. And then my agent calls and she said, he passed. And I said, okay, well that's kind of sucks, but she said, but don't worry, we'll go on to the #2 editor that I love. So then we did the same thing. She sends it to this editor. This woman calls me. We're on the phone for like an hour and a half. And she tells me how much she loves the book. And then she tells me everything that's wrong with the book. And there are two big things that we talked about. One, she said this book is too long. It was like 130,000 words at that point. And she said this book needs to be 90,000 words. So I ended up cutting 40,000 words out of the book. And then her second big bit of feedback was, because in that version that she read, Packard just moves to this small town to take this job. He's trying to get away from Minneapolis. He's had this tragedy in his life. He goes to this small town to take this sheriff's deputy job. And she was like, he needs to have a personal connection to this town, and he needs to have a personal connection to the girl who's missing. And she didn't tell me how to make that happen, but I just sat with it for a really long time. And then I figured it out. I was like, what if Ben Packard, what if he grew up in this small town? What if his grandparents had a cabin or a house in this small town, and they used to come here and spend their summers and holidays? And then I was like, well, why has he been gone all this time? Why does nobody recognize him? And then at the very kind of last point, the last draft of this book, I was like, he had an older brother who went missing, and this all feeds into the third book if you read it or haven't read it. I was like, he had an older brother who snuck out on a snowmobile one night, and they found the snowmobile. It fell through the ice in the lake, but they never found the body. That's why he's been gone. And that is, I was like, what happened to the brother? I don't know. I'll figure that out later. But that's what I wrote into this book for the second editor. And the other thing that we were talking about when she and I met, when she and I had this phone conversation, it was 3 weeks after George Floyd was murdered. And her big concern was trying to sell a book about a white cop from Minnesota. And I was absolutely kind of devastated hearing that. I completely understood that was the kind of the world that we were living in at the time. And it just was kind of heartbreaking that, this horrible event that happened was just the timing of it. The timing couldn't have been worse. But she's like, rewrite the book and then send it to me and we'll talk. So I rewrote the book, and then I got a call a few months later and she passed. I was like, I don't like this game where everybody gets their own version of the book written for them and then they just walk away from it. And so I was really starting to get kind of dispirited at this point. Then we went to my agent's third choice for a publisher, and this was Source Books, and I had a call with these two editors, and they told me and now they're reading the book that I wrote for The Last Lady, and they're telling me how much they love it, and I'm like, okay, but I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. You want me to rewrite it? And they're like, no, we love it. We're going to buy it as is. And so that's how I ended up at Poison Pen Press and Source Books. And they said, do you want to write more books with this character? And I said, sure. Don't ask me what happens yet, because I don't know. So they gave me a 2-book deal. And it takes, by the time we signed all the paperwork, it takes about 1.5 years for a book to come out. So while they were doing all their stuff to get the book ready to come out, I was writing the second book, which turned out to be Where the Dead Sleep. And there was this case in the news that I was following about a woman who was shot in her bed, and her husband was supposed to be lying next to her when he was wearing a white t-shirt, but he didn't have any blood on him. And I was just kind of following this, and I was like, did the husband do it? And I was waiting to see if they were going to charge the husband. And they ended up doing a whole 2-hour Dateline about this case, which came out after I'd finished writing the book. But I was just kind of turning this idea over in my head, and I was like, what if it was the husband who got shot in the bed instead of the wife who got shot in the bed? Where was the wife? What was she doing? And would they look at the wife as a suspect as closely as they would look at the husband when the genders are reversed? So I started working on that book, and I had that book done, I think, before the first book came out, and I had no idea how the first book was going to do, but my publisher just made miracles happen for this book. They just got it in major retailers, and they have a really strong independent bookstore sales team as well, and the first book just did incredibly well. And then Barnes & Noble said it's going to be our monthly mystery pick. And when the paperback came out, and they ordered 50,000 copies and put it in every single store on its own table with a big sign over it, which for a first-time author, that's just like, that just doesn't really happen. So then the second book was in production, and one day I opened my email, and it just said the subject line from my editor said William Kent Kruger, and I opened my email, and there was a blurb for the second book from William Kent Kruger, which I just was like walking into walls for days after that, because I went to so many library events just like this to see William Kent Kruger when I was young, and he wasn't even William Kent Kruger at that point. He was like William Kent Kruger, author of the Cork O'Connor series, not William Kent Kruger, author of Ordinary Grace, and those solo those standalone books that really kind of blew him up. But he was a huge name in Minnesota and regionally, and I would go and see him talk and hope that at this talk he was going to finally give me the secret to how to write a book. Because I thought for sure there was a secret, like a handshake or a code or something that somebody eventually would tell you how to kind of unlock how to do all this thing. That was like an amazing, I thought maybe William Kent Kruger will know who I am by the 10th book, not the second book. So then the second book came out, and the second book did really well, and they asked me, did I want to write more books? And I said, yeah, I do want to write more books. And so then I got another 2-book contract from them. And, in each of these books, Packard gets kind of frustratingly closer to figuring out what happened to his brother. And he kind of hits a wall at the end of the first book, and then he hits a really big wall, and there's a big kind of cliffhanger revelation at the end of the second book, related to his brother and his brother's case. So then when I was sat down to write the third book, I was like, okay, I can't tease this out any longer. I got to tell these people what happened to Packard's brother, which meant I had to figure out what happened to Packard's brother. As I was writing the second book, I started to have the idea, and I was like, okay, I think this is what happened to him. And there's a letter at the end of the second book. It's got some clues in it that he ends up following in the third book. So by the time I finished writing the second book, I kind of knew where I was going to go. And then I sat down to write the third book, and I was like, I don't know if the brother's case is big enough to carry this whole book. The idea that I had, I didn't know how to stretch it out for 300 pages, and I didn't want it to be a whole bunch of filler. So I was trying to think of, in each book, there's a murder that he's trying to solve, and then the brother thing is kind of going over it. So I had this idea for and trying to link the two stories. So his mom comes to town, there's kind of this bombshell revelation at the end of the second book. In the beginning of the third book, Packard's mom comes to town, and they go by his old grandparents' house, which he really hasn't been back to all this time, even that he's been in town. And they find out that the woman who's living there has died recently, and she supposedly fell down the stairs. But Packard is familiar with his house, and he's looking at things, and something about the story of her falling down the basement stairs just doesn't add up for him. And he starts asking more questions and asking more questions. And so the house kind of connects the two stories. The house is where his brother disappeared from 30 years ago, and the house is where Louise Larson died recently, falling down the stairs. And the more questions he starts to ask, the more pushback he gets, especially from the people within the department who are usually on his side. They think he's chasing windmills. So yeah, and then it's hard to talk about the third book and the crime in the third book without spoiling the third book. So I'm not going to really do that too much. We can get into that maybe in the questions. But he's working on this case, and the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this book a little bit too, going back to that editor's comment about a white cop from Minnesota, was I hadn't really talked about those issues, what policing looks like since George Floyd, and what police in Minnesota have been going through since then. And the book actually opens with Packard involved in a officer-involved shooting. This isn't much of a spoiler. It happens in the first 5 pages. That a man brings a gun to the courthouse where Packard is working security, and this man is involved in a case that's going on in one of the courtrooms, and he opens fire at the courthouse, and Packard has to shoot him and kill him, which puts him on leave, which gives him time to look into his brother's case and gives him time to look into the Louise Larson case, and also agonize a lot about his role in this shooting, and contributing to this narrative that the police show up with their guns and start shooting and ask questions later, and that's really kind of weighing on him psychologically and emotionally. And then we get to the end of the book, and at the end of the book he finds out what happened to his brother. I'm not going to spoil it, but I was happy with the ending, and I knew this book wasn't going to end with like a chase of a bad guy or a shootout related to the brother. It's not how I envisioned it going down. I thought it's going to be quieter, it's going to be more emotional, and I really kind of wanted it to be kind of devastating in kind of an emotional way rather than a big chase with bullets flying and things like that. I've heard from a lot of people it made him cry, which is exactly what I was going for. So that's where we're at now. It's the third book came out in February. It was a USA Today bestseller, my first time hitting a bestseller list, which was absolutely thrilling. I make my husband call me USA Today bestselling author Joshua Moehling all the time. I just quit my job in December of last year to be a full-time writer. My publisher came back and said, so I had two book deals with them, and even before the third book was out, they're like, do you want to write more books? And I was like, sure. And so I hit them up for a ton of money. And I was like, I want to quit my job amount of money. And it helps to have a husband who has health insurance. And so it all kind of came together, and now this is my full-time job, and I'm absolutely living my dream.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our club book audience for questions and comments for Joshua Moehling and his work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about Joshua Moehling's writing process.
Yeah, so the process has changed over the 3 books a little bit. They call writers like plotters or pantsers a lot of times. A plotter is a writer who sits down and figures out the plot, has a good outline before they start writing. A pantser is a writer who makes it up by the seat of their pants. They don't know where this story is going until they start writing it. Alan Eskins, if you guys have read his books, he's a great Minnesota author. He is a plotter to the extreme. He has a super long, super detailed outline. He knows everything that happens in every chapter before he sits down and writes, and then he can write the book really fast because he spent so much time on that outline. The first book I pantsed. I couldn't figure out, I didn't know where that book was going from one chapter to the next, and I kept writing myself into a corner, and I have to come back and fix things. It's probably why it was 135,000 words and needed to be 90,000 words. The second book, The Dead Sleep, the first book is a thriller. You know from page 1 who the bad guy is and where those kids are, and you're waiting for Packard to catch up the whole time. The second book, I wanted to try to write a whodunit, and I was like, well, if I'm going to write a whodunit, maybe I should know who did it before I start writing it. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the murder and who did it and why they did it and how they did it before I started writing the second book, which helped me write that book in much less time than the first book. And then the third book was a little bit of both. I knew it was time to figure out what happened to the brother, and I had this idea for, it kind of came, the crime in the third book came to me over time. So it was a little bit of both between kind of plotting and pantsing the third book.
This audience member asks if Moehling had a choice in who voiced his audiobooks.
So they sent me, when the first book was about to come out, they sent me 5 people who auditioned to read the audiobook. And 3 of them were women and 2 of them were men. And I don't listen to audiobooks. I haven't listened to a single audiobook all the way through, including my own. I listened to like 15 minutes of my own. And it just never occurred to me that a woman might narrate a book written by a man with a male protagonist and a male antagonist. But the men that they sent me who read it were terrible. And the woman who read it was just, I thought she was fantastic. She read like the first 2 pages, and I just liked her voice. I liked her take on that scene. And I don't know if it was really my choice or if they just let me think it was my choice. But I picked her, and that's who they went with, and she's done all 3 of the books.
This question is if Moehling worked with law enforcement to help inform his books and his characters.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about law enforcement when I was writing the first book. And as I was getting close to the end of it, I found something online advertising the Scott County Sheriff Citizens Academy. And it said you had to be a resident of Scott County or going to school in Scott County. I was neither of those things, but I called them and I said, I really, really want to go to this Citizens Academy. Can I come? And they were like, yes. But it was during COVID. And so the first time I took it, it was all online. And it was Monday nights for like 3 hours, and we'd Zoom in. And, all the different deputies would attend, and there was PowerPoint slides. And it was really, really, really helpful. I learned a lot from attending that academy that I was able to put into the book before the first book came out. And then I went again like 2 years ago in person and drove down to Scott County for like 6 or 8 Mondays in a row. And then it was so much better because then we got to like get in the vehicles, and we got to go to the gun range, and we got to go to the jail, and we got to see him fly the drone and meet the canine. So it was much, much more hands-on. Talk to the detectives, talk to the sheriff. So a lot of what I've learned went into the books. And for the third book, I researched a lot how, what happens when a law enforcement officer is involved in a shooting. There's a lot of, you can go to like I found a policies and procedures manual in a Minnesota Sheriff's County website that said exactly what they do after there's an officer involved shooting, and they collect their gear, and then they go to and get a blood and a urine test, and then the BCA gets involved, and so I tried to get that as correct as I could. Speaking of what's the Minnesota writer's name we were just talking about? Nope, the other one. Alan Eskins. Alan Eskins used to be a county attorney, a prosecutor attorney. And we did an event a few months ago, and he asked me, did you used to be a lawyer? And I said, no. And he said, are you a lawyer? And I said, no. And he said, you got a lot of those details in that third book right, exactly right, about how they go about investigating and making a decision on whether to file charges when there's an officer-involved shooting. So I try to put in enough detail to make you think I know what I'm talking about. There's this other writer, her name is Claire McIntosh, and she worked in the police in the UK for 15 years. And she wrote an essay recently that said you can't go for 100% accuracy when writing about police, because so much of police work is boring. So much of police work is calling, making phone calls, waiting for the phone to ring. It's writing reports. It's doing a lot. It's not just driving fast and chasing bad guys. And so she's got 15 years experience in writing about police, and she says she doesn't go for 100% accuracy when she tries to explain what the police do.
Our next question is where Joshua Moehling likes to write.
Mostly at home. I live walking distance to the library in Golden Valley, and they have these really nice little brick study rooms that are like prison cells. There's nothing to look at, there's nothing to do except stare at the brick wall. So I like to go there a little bit. And then I have a writing partner, Gretchen Anthony, who's a great Minnesota author. She and I met at the Loft. We were taking this Loft class together, and she got an agent before I did, and she got a book deal before I did. And she was just a huge inspiration to me, because I felt like I was so close to making this happen. And there was somebody who was on the same path that I was, who was just 2 steps ahead of me. And I was like, I can do this. If Gretchen can do it, I can do it. And we became really good friends in that class. And we meet together on Saturdays a lot and go to Panera and jibber jabber for about half an hour. And then we try to get some words on the page while we're together. And it's just a great kind of like an accountability partner. We had brainstorm and each other with whatever it is that we're working on, and it's really nice to have somebody to work with like that.
This Club Book audience member wonders what Joshua Moehling is reading right now.
Do you guys know Tim Johnston? He's a Iowa writer. Oh my God, he's so amazing. He wrote these 3 books. The first one's called Descent. The second one's called The Current. The newest one that came out last year, I think, was called Distant Suns. And the first book, his first book is a little bit like my first book, and it involves a girl being kidnapped and held prisoner by a man in the mountains of Colorado. And his book's not so much about this, like the police trying to find the girl, as it is about how this horrible event absolutely devastates her family, and they absolutely fall apart. And it's very kind of literary and beautifully written. And yes, you know what happens to the girl, and yes, there's a resolution to that. But it's a dark but beautiful novel. And then he wrote a second book called The Current about this guy who's suspected in the death of his girlfriend, who somebody put her in the river and she drowned. And then in the third book, the brother of the girl who's kidnapped from the first book and the guy who's a suspect in the second book meet up together in a small town in Wisconsin in the third book, and they're doing handyman work on this old man's house who's long been suspected of in relation to the disappearance of these young boys who went missing 30 or 40 years ago. And Tim Johnston just writes so beautifully about these really kind of dark situations in life in the small towns and men going about their business. And I'm just such a huge fan of Tim Johnston. And then I just this morning started, have you guys read the Magpie Murders or the Mayflower Murders? Anthony Horowitz. I think he's from the UK. They made the first two books into a miniseries on PBS, but he's got the third book out now, and it's about an editor who works with this author on his series of books, and the author is a jerk. I can't talk about it without spoiling too much of it, but they're really good books, and the third book in the series is out. Anthony Horowitz is the author.
Our next question is about the next Ben Packard book.
Book 4 is written. It will be out in May. It's called Beneath a Broken Sky, and it's we used to have a cabin over by Amory, Wisconsin, and a derecho came through there. I think it was in 2019, and just snapped the top off of every single tree. We had a tree go through the house. The straight line winds were just devastated kind of the whole area. And so that's kind of been in the back of my mind for a while now. And so book 4 opens with this derecho that's hit Sandy Lake and turned the town really upside down. And Packard's been working around the clock in kind of the emergency response role, and somebody gets killed. And that's book 4. And I just went up to Bemidji about a month ago because they had that derecho that just went through Bemidji. And I went up there about a month after it happened because the book 4 takes place about a month after this derecho hit. So I just went up there to drive around and see, what the town was like and read the local paper and kind of refresh my memory with what this kind of small towns look like and what they go through when they have a natural disaster like this. The newest contract I have for my publisher is for books 5, 6, and 7, and 2 of those books are going to be Ben Packard books, and one's going to be a standalone, but it won't have anything to do with Ben Packard or Sandy Lake, the idea that I have for that book.
Our last question of the night comes from a fan inquiring if Moehling has any favorite characters in his books.
One of my favorite secondary characters is Kelly, who's the admin in the sheriff's department. And a lot of people ask me if any of the characters are based on people I know, and the answer's almost always no. But Kelly is actually based on somebody that I know. And she and I used to work together at Medtronic, and our cubes are right by each other. And we did a lot of traveling together for work. And Kelly loves getting her nails done, and she's got big bangs, and she likes jewelry, and she's the world's biggest Barry Manilow fan. And I just knew I was going to I just loved Kelly, and I was like, this admin, and she's the boss. And Kelly, in real life, she was the boss. You do whatever Kelly says. And I knew that's what this admin was going to be like in the sheriff's department. And then when I was writing the second book, I was like, I think I'm going to make Kelly a Barry Manilow fan. Are you okay with that? And Kelly was like, yeah, she loved it. But Kelly's seen Barry Manilow in concert over 200 times.
The real one or the one in the book?
The real one. I know, it's hard to believe. It sounds like fiction, doesn't it? She and her girlfriends, like when Barry Manilow had like a Las Vegas residency, they would go see his show twice a day for like 3 days in a row. And I've seen Barry Manilow in concert twice, and that was plenty. The first time was like 10 years ago, and then we just saw him maybe a year or two ago, whenever he was last in town. And it was the same show. I was like, come on. I saw this show 10 years ago, and I'm sure that's been the same show that Kelly's seen 200 times. But yeah, that's a little bit of real life that crept into the books. And I just want to say thank you for being here, and thank you to Red Balloon for being here, and thank you to Dakota County Library for having me. It's been an honor. So thank you very much.
That wraps up our Dakota County Library event with Joshua Moehling. Make sure to catch our next podcast with Al Casimano. Al Casimano is the pen behind Finlay Donovan is Killing It, and the chart-topping series it spawned. Her domestic anti-hero is back in Finlay Donovan Digs Her Own Grave, in which the writer turned sleuth applies her newfound skills to solving a murder committed close to home, as in just across the street. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including Melsa, Library Strategies, and Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.